The day Maya walked out of my life is burned into my memory. She stood at the door, bags packed, wearing that look of disdain she perfected over the last few months of our marriage. "I deserve more," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Those words echoed in my mind long after she closed the door behind her. More. More than the life we'd built together, more than the love I had poured into our marriage, and more than I could apparently provide. I was left standing in the empty hallway, staring at the space she'd occupied moments before. 8 years together, gone in an instant. The pain was suffocating. Maya wasn't just my wife. She had been my partner, my confidant, my home. And now, she was gone, leaving me to pick up the shattered pieces of the life we'd shared. The betrayal didn't stop at her departure. I soon learned she had left me for Mark, a man whose wealth and influence dwarfed mine. Mark, the flashy businessman who had been a shadow in the background of our social circles, promising Maya a life of luxury that I could never match. The humiliation was unbearable. Friends and acquaintances whispered behind my back, their pitying glances cutting deeper than words ever could. I spent those first few weeks and a days, drowning in confusion and anger. I questioned everything. Was I not enough? Had I missed the signs? The memories of us together, the laughter, the shared dreams, now felt like cruel reminders of my failure to hold on to her. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house, once a comforting haven, now pressed down on me like a physical weight. But amidst the wreckage of my marriage, something began to stir. At first, it was a faint ember of determination, barely noticeable through the fog of heartbreak. Slowly, it grew stronger. I realized I couldn't stay in that place, mentally or emotionally. Maya had made her choice, and while I couldn't change that, I could decide how I responded. This wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was worth more than the scraps she had left behind. I threw myself into my work. My startup, which had been little more than a passion project, became my refuge. The long hours and relentless focus gave me a sense of purpose, something to anchor me when everything else felt uncertain. It wasn't easy. Those first few months were a blur of late nights, empty coffee cups, and moments of doubt. But each small victory, each client signed or deal closed, reignited a part of me that Maya's betrayal had tried to extinguish. Friends and family rallied around me, their unwavering support a lifeline during the darkest days. Chris, my closest friend, became my unofficial therapist, dragging me out for beers when I needed to vent and reminding me that life didn't end just because my marriage had. "You've got this, Noah," he'd say. "She's not worth the energy you're wasting on her." The turning point came one night as I sat in my home office, staring at the vision board I'd made for my business. Among the scattered notes and sketches was a quote I'd scribbled months ago but had forgotten about. "What defines us is how well we rise after falling." The words hit me like a lightning bolt. I had fallen, yes, but I wasn't broken. I was still standing, still fighting, still capable of building something extraordinary. It was then that I made a vow, not to Maya, not to Mark, but to myself. I would rise. I would take every ounce of pain and humiliation and channel it into something greater. My life wasn't over just because Maya had walked out. If anything, it was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small shifts. The house didn't feel as empty, the silence not as oppressive. The ache in my chest started to dull, replaced by a quiet resolve. I focused on what I could control, my business, my health, and my relationships. Slowly but surely, the man I had been before Maya's betrayal began to re-emerge, stronger and more determined than ever. Maya's departure had been a devastating blow, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my terms. As I stood in the doorway of my home one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, I realized something profound. I didn't need Maya or her validation to feel whole. I was enough. I had always been enough. The first few months after Maya left were nothing short of brutal. Everywhere I turned, there were reminders of her. Her favorite coffee mug on the kitchen counter, the perfume lingering on the pillows, the stack of books she swore she'd read but never got around to. The emptiness in the house wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Her absence left a void that felt impossible to fill. I tried to bury myself in work, but even that was a struggle. Running a small startup demands constant attention and energy, but my focus was shattered. Every task felt like a mountain, every email a reminder of how disconnected I was from the world. The office, usually a place of excitement and purpose, became just another space where her betrayal haunted me. My friends and family did their best to support me, but there was only so much they could do. Chris, my ever-loyal best friend, was practically living at my house, dragging me out for drinks or takeout whenever he sensed I was spiraling. "Noah, you can't let her win," he'd say. "She left, but that doesn't mean she gets to take everything with her, including your sanity." He was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The nights were the worst. Alone in the bed we once shared, the silence was deafening. I'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every argument, every moment when Maya's dissatisfaction seeped into our marriage. Was it my fault? Did I miss the signs? These questions swirled endlessly, each one cutting deeper than the last. But even in the darkest moments, there was a flicker of something. Call it anger, call it determination. That kept me moving. I couldn't let her betrayal define me. I had worked too hard to let my life crumble because of her decision to walk away. Slowly, I started to claw my way back. Work became my lifeline. I poured every ounce of pain and frustration into my startup, using it as a way to channel my emotions. The office became my second home. Early mornings bled into late nights, and weekends no longer existed. It was exhausting, but it was also cathartic. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over something, even if it was just the layout of a client proposal or the wording of a pitch. At first, the progress was slow, painfully slow. Small contracts trickled in, barely enough to keep the business afloat. But with each new deal, my confidence grew. I started setting goals, not just for the company but for myself. Each milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. A signed contract wasn't just a step forward for the business. It was a reminder that I was capable, that I could succeed without her. Bit by bit, the loneliness began to fade. I stopped dreading the empty house and started seeing it as an opportunity. It was mine now, a space I could shape however I wanted. I moved furniture, painted walls, and cleared out every trace of Maya's influence. It was therapeutic, a way of reclaiming not just my home but my identity. One evening, as I sat at the dining table reviewing spreadsheets, I noticed something unusual. I felt calm. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest wasn't there. The hurt hadn't vanished. It was still there, simmering below the surface, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. I was starting to see the betrayal for what it was, a turning point, not an ending. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to thrive. Maya's departure was a blow, yes, but it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to rebuild, to refocus, and to become the version of myself I had always wanted to be. She had left me for someone else, believing I wasn't enough. I was determined to prove her wrong, not for her sake, but for mine. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, something I hadn't done in years. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at my desk, and mapped out a plan for the next 6 months. It wasn't just about growing the business. It was about growing as a person. I made a list of goals: reconnect with old friends, get back into shape, pick up a hobby I'd abandoned. Each one was a step toward reclaiming the parts of me that had been lost during my marriage. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready to face it. For the first time since Maya left, I felt a spark of hope. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new. Small victories began to accumulate, slowly pulling me out of the shadow Maya's betrayal had cast over my life. The startup that once felt like a lifeline had started to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Contracts that once seemed impossible to land were now coming my way, and the steady influx of work gave me something invaluable: momentum. Every milestone became a celebration of resilience. The first 5-figure contract, the first glowing client testimonial, the first time I saw my company's name featured in an industry blog. It all felt surreal. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was creating something far greater than I had ever imagined. And with each step forward, the sting of Maya's betrayal faded a little more. My workdays were long, often stretching into the early hours of the morning, but it didn't feel like a burden. The hustle wasn't about burying my pain anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could thrive on my own terms. Each task completed, each challenge overcome, reminded me that I was capable, driven, and worthy of success. Beyond the business, I started to see changes in myself. The lethargy that had clung to me in the aftermath of Maya's departure was gone. I felt sharper, more focused, and more present in my own life. I reconnected with old hobbies, dusting off my guitar and playing music that had once been my escape. I started hitting the gym again, transforming my anger and frustration into physical strength. The reflection staring back at me in the mirror wasn't just healing, it was evolving. Then came the moment I realized I had truly turned a corner. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting in a cafe after a meeting with a prospective client. As I sipped my coffee and reviewed notes, I caught myself smiling. Not at anything in particular, just at the feeling of being alive and in control of my own destiny. It was a far cry from the broken man who had spent sleepless nights questioning his worth. My friends, particularly Chris, noticed the shift. "You're not just surviving anymore," he said during one of our weekly dinners. "You're thriving. It's inspiring, man." I shrugged, not out of humility, but out of genuine contentment. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. Not to Maya, not to Chris, not even to myself. It was simply about living. Months passed, and with each one, the business grew stronger. I hired my first employee, a sharp, motivated college graduate who brought fresh energy to the team. The expansion felt surreal. What had started as a desperate attempt to distract myself from heartbreak had become a thriving enterprise. The house, once a painful reminder of the life Maya and I had shared, was now a reflection of my newfound independence. I replaced the furniture we'd picked out together with pieces that suited my style. The walls were lined with framed photos of moments that brought me joy. Landscapes from hikes, candid shots of friends, and even a photo of the first dollar my business earned. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the weight of Maya's expectations, free from the need to measure up to someone else's idea of success, and free to live life on my own terms. The anger I once carried had dissolved, replaced by a quiet confidence. I didn't need to gloat or seek revenge. My success was its own form of justice. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in hand, I thought about how far I'd come. Maya had left me for Mark, chasing a life of luxury she believed I couldn't provide. But I had built something far greater, something real, something lasting. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man she thought wasn't enough had become someone even I could be proud of. It was in that moment, under the golden hues of the setting sun, that I realized I didn't miss Maya anymore. The life we'd shared, the pain of her betrayal, the humiliation, it was all a distant memory. What mattered now was the life I had built from the ashes, a life that was wholly and unapologetically mine. As the stars began to dot the sky, I raised my glass to the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. This was my story, and I was finally the one writing it. Years passed, and the life I built from the rubble of Maya's betrayal had flourished in ways I never expected. My business was no longer a scrappy startup. It was a thriving enterprise with a growing team and an even larger network of clients. I had carved out a reputation for myself as a resilient entrepreneur, someone who could weather storms and come out stronger on the other side. I rarely thought about Maya anymore. Her departure had been a defining moment, but it no longer defined me. That chapter of my life was closed, and I had moved on. Or so I thought. One evening, I found myself attending a high-profile business gala. One of those events where the room was filled with polished smiles, tailored suits, and the hum of people networking over overpriced champagne. I had been invited as a guest speaker, a milestone that felt like a testament to how far I had come. As I stood near the bar, sipping a drink and scanning the room, my gaze landed on a familiar figure. My chest tightened. Maya. She looked the same, though there was a weariness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was standing near a group of people, laughing politely at something someone had said. It wasn't long before her gaze drifted across the room and locked onto mine. Her laughter faltered, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me wanted to walk away, to preserve the peace I had worked so hard to achieve. But another part of me, the part that had spent years replaying her betrayal in my mind, felt an odd sense of curiosity. What was she doing here? What had her life become? To my surprise, it was Maya who made the first move. She excused herself from the group and walked toward me, her steps hesitant but purposeful. When she reached me, she offered a small, tentative smile. "Noah," she said, her voice soft but familiar. "It's been a long time." "It has," I replied evenly, my expression giving away nothing. "How have you been?" She hesitated, as though unsure of how to answer. "Good," she said finally. "Busy. You know how life gets." I nodded, keeping my tone polite but distant. "Yes, I do." Her eyes scanned me, as though trying to gauge how much I had changed, or perhaps how much I hadn't. "You look well," she said after a moment. "Successful." "I am," I said simply. "And you?" She hesitated again, her confidence wavering for the first time. "I'm doing fine," she said, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. Before the conversation could continue, a man approached us. He was tall, well-dressed, and exuded a kind of practiced charm. Maya turned to him with a strained smile. "Noah, this is Mark," she said, her tone clipped. Mark extended his hand, his grin confident but shallow. "Noah," he said, his voice smooth, "I've heard a lot about you." "I'm sure you have," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. I couldn't help but notice the flicker of unease in his eyes. The conversation was brief and awkward. Maya seemed uncomfortable, and Mark, though outwardly composed, had a nervous energy about him. When they excused themselves, I felt a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction, curiosity, and something close to pity. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but my encounter with Maya and Mark lingered in my mind. Seeing her again had stirred memories I thought I had buried, but it also reinforced how far I had come. I was no longer the man she had left behind. I was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. Whatever she and Mark were chasing, it wasn't my concern. My life was no longer tied to theirs. As I left the gala that night, stepping into the crisp evening air, I felt a deep sense of closure. Maya's betrayal had once been the darkest chapter of my life, but now it was nothing more than a footnote. The life I had rebuilt, no, the life I had created, was brighter, richer, and far more fulfilling than anything I had shared with her. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The encounter with Maya and Mark at the gala lingered in my mind for a few days, not because it stirred up old feelings I had long since moved on, but because of the peculiar exchange. There was something in Maya's demeanor, a flicker of discomfort, and in Mark's overly polished charm, a hint of desperation. I had no desire to involve myself in their lives, but a part of me couldn't help wondering, had they truly found the happiness they sought? Fate, however, seemed intent on offering me answers. A few weeks later, I attended another business event, this time a smaller networking dinner. To my surprise, Maya was there again, this time without Mark. She spotted me as I walked in, and before I could retreat to a less visible corner of the room, she approached. "Noah," she said, her voice softer than at the gala. "Do you have a moment?" I hesitated, torn between politeness and my instinct to avoid unnecessary interactions. Finally, I nodded. "Sure." We stepped aside, away from the bustling crowd. She looked at me, her eyes carrying a weight I hadn't seen before. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her words tumbling out quickly. "For everything, for how I left, for what I said, for how I treated you. I didn't realize how much I took for granted." Her apology caught me off guard. I studied her face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but all I saw was regret. "Why now?" I asked, my tone calm but direct. She hesitated, glancing down at her hands before meeting my gaze again. "Because seeing you at the gala, seeing how much you've accomplished, how composed you were, it made me realize what I lost. And because, she trailed off, her voice faltering. Because what? I prompted, my curiosity piqued despite myself. Because things with Mark aren't what I thought they'd be, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He's not the man he pretends to be. His wealth, it's gone. His charm, it's a facade. I thought I was trading up, but I was wrong. Her confession stirred something in me, but it wasn't pity or satisfaction. It was a sense of validation, not from her words, but from the fact that I no longer needed her validation. The man I had become didn't need Maya's regret to affirm his worth. Maya, I said after a long pause, I appreciate your apology, but it doesn't change what happened. You made your choices, and I made mine. I've moved on. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I understand, she said quietly. I hope you know how sorry I am. For a brief moment, I considered saying something comforting, something that would ease her guilt. But then I realized that wasn't my responsibility. Maya's choices were hers to live with, just as mine were mine to embrace. Take care of yourself, Maya, I said, my voice steady. And with that, I walked away. Later that evening, as I sat on my porch with a glass of wine in hand, I reflected on the conversation. It didn't bring the sense of closure I thought it might, but that was because I already had closure. Maya's apology, while meaningful, was unnecessary. I had long since closed the chapter she had tried to reopen. The days that followed were filled with quiet contentment. My business continued to thrive, my social circle expanded, and my relationship with myself deepened. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided by betrayal. I was someone who had faced adversity and come out stronger, someone who had rebuilt a life worth living. As for Maya, I heard through the grapevine that her relationship with Mark had ended. He had left her to deal with the financial and emotional fallout of his empty promises. The life she had chased, the one she thought would bring her happiness, had crumbled beneath her. And while I didn't wish her ill, I couldn't bring myself to care. My life was no longer tied to hers. It was mine, full, vibrant, and brimming with possibility. The future was wide open, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms. The aftermath of my encounter with Maya at the networking event brought a strange sense of finality. Her apology had been genuine, but it didn't stir anything within me. I didn't need her regret, and I certainly didn't need her validation. I had built my life without her, and that life had grown into something I was genuinely proud of. She was a fragment of my past, while my future was full of promise. But as life often does, it wasn't done surprising me. A week later, while I was in my office reviewing some contracts, my assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said cautiously. "She says it's personal." I frowned. Personal visits weren't something I entertained, especially during business hours. "Who is it?" She said her name is Maya. Her name was a punch to the gut, though not in the way it once would have been. I felt more annoyance than anything else. What could she possibly want now? "Send her in," I said after a pause. Maya entered the room hesitantly, a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her usual confidence had been replaced by a nervous energy, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I gestured for her to sit, but I didn't offer any pleasantries. "Noah," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I have no right to be here, but I didn't know who else to turn to." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "What's going on, Maya?" She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "Mark left me," she said finally. He was using me, just like you said. His money was gone long before I met him, and he lied about everything. When things got tough, he abandoned me." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't spark the sympathy she seemed to be hoping for. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my tone neutral. "Because I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I should never have left you. I thought I wanted more, but I didn't realize I already had everything I needed. I don't know how to fix this." I stared at her for a long moment, processing her words. The old me might have felt a pang of longing or the temptation to take her back, but the man I had become, the man she had unknowingly shaped through her betrayal, wasn't swayed by her tears. "Maya," I said evenly, "you didn't just leave me. You broke my trust. humiliated me, and dismissed everything we built together. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered. I know I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me or take me back, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Her apology didn't feel like closure. It felt like a plea for redemption. And while I appreciated her honesty, I knew it wasn't my responsibility to grant her peace. I've moved on, I said firmly. I've built a life without you, and it's a life I'm proud of. I don't need your apology, Maya. I've already forgiven you, not for your sake, but for mine. She nodded again, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand, she said quietly. I hope you find happiness, Noah. You deserve it. I didn't respond, letting the silence speak for me. After a moment, she stood and walked to the door. She paused, looking back at me one last time, but I didn't meet her gaze. When the door closed behind her, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Her visit hadn't reopened old wounds. It had cemented the fact that I had healed. Her regret was hers to carry, and my life wasn't tied to hers anymore. I was free. That evening, as I sat on the balcony of my home, the city lights stretching out before me, I felt an immense sense of gratitude. Maya's betrayal had once been the worst thing to happen to me, but it had also been the catalyst for my transformation. Without it, I might never have discovered my strength, my resilience, or my ability to create a life of my own. I raised a glass to the night sky, silently toasting to the journey that had brought me here. Maya and Mark's stories no longer mattered to me. This was my chapter now, and I intended to write it with intention, purpose, and joy. In the days following Maya's visit to my office, I felt a profound sense of clarity. Her confession, while unexpected, had reinforced what I already knew. I had moved on. My life wasn't tied to her regrets or her broken dreams. I had built something real, something solid, and I wasn't about to let the ghosts of my past disrupt it. Meanwhile, work continued to flourish. The business was thriving, and new opportunities kept rolling in. I found myself busier than ever, but it was a good kind of busy, the kind that reminded me I was in control of my destiny. The team I had built was stronger than ever, and each success felt like another step away from the pain of the past. But even as I thrived, whispers of Maya and Mark's unraveling reached me. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Mark had disappeared entirely, leaving Maya to fend for herself. The luxurious lifestyle she had pursued was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of struggling to make ends meet. I didn't revel in her downfall. I didn't feel pity either. It was simply the natural consequence of the choices she had made. One day, Chris and I were catching up over drinks at our favorite bar when he brought up Maya. Did you hear? He asked, leaning in conspiratorially. She's living in some tiny apartment downtown, working part-time at a boutique. I nodded, sipping my drink. I figured things would go that way after Mark left. Chris studied me for a moment before smiling. You're not even fazed, are you? A year ago, this would have eaten you alive. I chuckled, shaking my head. A year ago, I was still holding on to anger. But now, it's just irrelevant. Chris raised his glass in a toast. To irrelevance, then, and to moving on. We clinked glasses, and I felt a wave of gratitude for friends like Chris who had stood by me during the hardest times. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, and my stomach sank as I realized it was from Maya. Part of me wanted to toss it in the trash without opening it, but curiosity won out. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Noah, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I felt I needed to write this. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for the years we spent together, for the love you gave me, and for being the person I didn't deserve. I realize now how much I took you for granted, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life. I hope you're happy. Truly, you deserve it. I folded the letter and set it aside, feeling nothing. Her words, though earnest, didn't evoke any strong emotions. It wasn't satisfaction or closure, it was indifference. The kind of indifference that comes when someone no longer holds any power over you. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset, I reflected on how far I had come. The man I was when Maya left was a shadow of the person I had become. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been transformative. It forced me to confront my pain, my insecurities, and my worth. And in doing so, I had built a life that was fuller and richer than anything I could have imagined. Maya's apology, while appreciated, wasn't necessary. I didn't need her acknowledgement to validate my journey. I had already reclaimed my power, my peace, and my happiness. As the stars began to dot the sky, I raised my glass to the quiet resilience that had carried me through the storm. Maya and Mark were chapters in my story, but they weren't the whole book. I had so much more to write, and for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely excited about the possibilities. The past no longer had a hold on me. This was my life, my journey, and I intended to live it fully and unapologetically. The legal and emotional closure I had sought was now complete, and with Maya's chapter firmly closed, I turned my attention fully to my present and future. The life I had built in her absence was thriving. My business was flourishing, my friendships were stronger than ever, and my sense of self-worth had reached heights I hadn't thought possible. One of the most rewarding aspects of my journey was the freedom I now felt. No longer tethered to the weight of betrayal, I explored parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I started traveling, visiting places I had once only dreamed of. Each new destination felt like a metaphorical step away from the past, a journey into a future that I was shaping with my own hands. But even as I moved forward, reminders of Maya and Mark's fallout occasionally surfaced. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Maya had tried to reconcile with some of the friends we once shared, but her efforts were met with mixed reactions. Many had lost respect for her after seeing how she had treated me. The once confident and glamorous woman was now a shadow of herself, struggling to rebuild her life from the ground up. Mark, on the other hand, had all but disappeared. The lavish lifestyle he had flaunted was revealed to be nothing more than a house of cards, and when it all came crashing down, he left Maya to deal with the aftermath. Hearing this didn't bring me any satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of the justice life had delivered on its own. One afternoon, as I was reviewing plans for my company's expansion, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Chris, grinning from ear to ear as he entered my office. "You've been working too hard, my friend," he announced, dropping a bag on my desk. "Pack your things. We're going hiking." "Hiking?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You hate hiking." "I do," he admitted, "but you love it. And you've been cooped up in here long enough. Come on. I already cleared your schedule with your assistant." Laughing, I gave in. Chris had been there for me during my darkest days, and if he was willing to endure something he hated just to drag me outside, I owed him the courtesy of going along. The hike turned out to be exactly what I needed. As we climbed higher, leaving the noise of the city behind, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The air was crisp, the view breathtaking, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't thinking about Maya, or Mark, or the betrayal that had once consumed me. All I could feel was gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. As we reached the summit, Chris turned to me with a satisfied grin. "Worth it?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said, taking in the panoramic view. The world stretched out before me, vast and full of possibility. It was a reminder that life moves on, that even the most painful chapters eventually give way to something new. That evening, as we sat by a campfire under a canopy of stars, Chris asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about forgiving her? Maya, I mean." I poked at the fire with a stick, considering his words. "I don't think it's about forgiveness anymore," I said finally. "I've moved past the anger, the hurt, even the need for closure. She's a part of my story, but she doesn't define it. I don't hold any grudges, but I also don't feel the need to reconcile. I've let it go." Chris nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "You've come a long way, Noah," he said, raising his beer. "Here's to new beginnings." We toasted, and as the fire crackled and the night deepened, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The betrayal that had once consumed me was now nothing more than a memory, a chapter in the story of my life that had shaped me but didn't define me. The future was wide open, and for the first time, I wasn't just ready to face it. I was excited for what it might bring. The months that followed felt like a golden era in my life. My business continued to expand, cementing its reputation in the industry, and with each milestone, I felt more grounded and fulfilled. The pain and betrayal that once haunted me had transformed into lessons, ones that shaped the man I had become. I no longer viewed my past as a wound, but as a stepping stone that led me to where I was today. But life, as unpredictable as ever, had one more surprise in store for me. One afternoon, as I walked into a coffee shop near my office, I spotted Maya sitting at a corner table. She was alone, her once vibrant aura dimmed. Her hair was tied back simply, her makeup understated, if any at all. She looked up and saw me, her eyes widening slightly before she offered a tentative smile. I debated walking away, pretending I hadn't seen her, but something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't the smug confidence I'd grown used to. It was humility. Curiosity won out, and I approached her table. "Noah," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Do you have a minute?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She gestured to the chair across from her, and I sat down. For a moment, there was silence as she fiddled with her coffee cup. Then she took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "I've thought about this moment for a long time, and I'm not even sure if I have the right to say anything. But I want to thank you for everything, for the years we spent together, for the love you gave me, and for not holding on to hate when I hurt you." Her words surprised me, though I kept my expression neutral. "Why now?" I asked. She sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Because I've hit rock bottom, Noah, and when you're at the bottom, all you have are regrets. I've lost everything, Mark, the life I thought I wanted, the respect of people I cared about. And when I look back, all I see is you, and how I let you go." Her voice trembled, and I could see genuine sorrow in her eyes. "You didn't deserve what I did to you. I thought I was chasing happiness, but I was just running from my own insecurities. And now I'm here, trying to piece together a life that feels worth living." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. For the first time, I saw Maya not as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone who was deeply flawed, struggling to make sense of her mistakes. It didn't erase what she had done, but it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. "I appreciate your honesty," I said finally, "but you don't owe me anything, Maya. I've moved on, and I'm in a good place. I hope you find your own path, too." She nodded, her expression bittersweet. "I'm glad you're happy, Noah. You deserve it." We exchanged a few more words, but there was no animosity, no lingering tension. As I left the coffee shop, I felt an unexpected lightness. Maya's apology wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about releasing the past. And in doing so, she had allowed me to let go of the final threads of resentment I hadn't even realized I was holding on to. That evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the city lights twinkle, I reflected on how far I had come. The man I was when Maya left me was unrecognizable compared to the man I had become. I had faced heartbreak, betrayal, and loss, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more at peace than ever before. Maya and Mark were chapters in my story, but they weren't the final chapters. They were simply stepping stones that had led me to a life I was proud of, a life I had built with my own hands. With the cool evening breeze brushing against my face, I raised a glass to the sky, to growth, to resilience, to a future that was mine to shape. This was my story, and I was ready for whatever came next. Life had a way of surprising me when I least expected it. After my encounter with Maya at the coffee shop, I thought that was the last page of her chapter in my life. Her apology had given me closure, but it didn't stir any desire to reconnect. It felt like the universe was tying up loose ends, ensuring I could move forward without any lingering questions or regrets. And move forward I did. The business expansion I had been working on for years reached its pinnacle. My company, once a scrappy startup, had become a leader in the industry. I traveled frequently, speaking at conferences, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and establishing partnerships that only reinforced my success. Each milestone was a reminder of how far I had come, not just professionally, but personally. The man I saw in the mirror every morning was someone I was proud of, someone who had risen above betrayal and heartbreak to reclaim his life. But the most significant transformation wasn't in my business or social circle. It was in how I viewed myself. For years, I had tied my worth to the relationships I was in, the roles I played in other people's lives. Losing Maya had forced me to confront the emptiness I had tried to fill with validation from others. And in doing so, I had discovered something far more valuable: self-respect. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on the patio of my newly purchased home overlooking a serene lake, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The house was a symbol of my new beginning. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a sanctuary, a space that I had made entirely my own. From the minimalist decor to the carefully curated art pieces, every detail reflected the man I had become. As I sipped my coffee and watched the water ripple in the breeze, I felt a profound sense of peace. For the first time in years, there were no lingering shadows, no unresolved pain. The betrayal that had once defined my life was now just a memory, a chapter in a story that had taken a turn for the better. I occasionally heard updates about Maya through mutual acquaintances. She was working at a small boutique downtown, trying to rebuild her life after her relationship with Mark imploded. From what I gathered, she was managing, but barely. There was no schadenfreude in hearing about her struggles, just a quiet acknowledgement that life often teaches its lessons the hard way. One day, while attending a charity event, I bumped into Chris, my steadfast friend who had been with me through it all. He clapped me on the back, grinning as he handed me a drink. "Look at you," he said, "the poster boy for resilience." I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know about that, but I'm happy, Chris. Truly." He raised his glass. "To happiness, then, and to never letting the past hold you back."